Welcome, everyone. We will be getting started in just a minute. Make sure you got everything you need. Get yourself situated. Like I said, probably in about 2 minutes or so, we'll get started with our program for this evening. Our program this evening will be about an hour long, so if you wanted to grab your drink or anything like that, feel free to do so now in the next couple of minutes. All right, well, we are going to go ahead and dive on in because we have so much interesting and cool stuff to cover tonight. So hello, welcome, good evening. Welcome to our History Happy Hour, a Vote of Voice. My name is Beth Whitaker, and I'm Manager of Education at the Indiana Historical Society. It's great to see so many of you on here tonight. This happy hour is brought to you with support from One America Financial Partners, a national provider in the insurance and financial services marketplace. Excuse me, sorry for that. At the Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting millions and millions of paper-based documents that tell Indiana's unique stories through things like books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, etc. And we find all these really intriguing and unexpected ways to share and remember the past. So we do this through publications, exhibits, and events like this. It's through these pieces that we tell all of these diverse and unconventional, and sometimes even a little saucy, stories of Indiana, and inspire a future grounded in our state's uniting values and principles. Tonight, we are going to be looking at the history of voting and campaigns and elections in Indiana. So before I introduce Ray, our moderator, few logistical pieces. So for this event, Ray and Matthew Kochevar are going to be chatting for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you at the end. So as we're going along, if a question pops in your mind or you're thinking of something, feel free to drop it into the Q&A section or into the chat. We'll keep an eye on that and try to pepper that in as we go along. Now, you are all muted tonight, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear your voice and your thoughts. So the way to do that is to add the comments to the chat box as we go. Make sure that you're replying to all panelists and all attendees. That way everybody gets to see what you're saying and can share in those replies. And keep your eye on that chat box because we will be dropping in some URLs throughout the evening. But don't worry if you miss out on some of those, because we will be sending you an email sometime tomorrow that has all of them in it. So again, on the screen, you'll see where that chat function is and the Q&A box is. So you'll be able to use that. So if you enjoy this program, which I'm sure you will, make sure that you come back for more. We have History Happy Hours happening several more Thursdays in a row. So you can sign up for those and more programs at indianahistory.org. Now, let's get started with the good stuff. So, I'm so excited. I'm sorry, I'm like pausing because I have to catch my breath because I'm so excited for tonight's program. First, I would like to introduce Ray Boomhower. He is senior editor at the Indiana Historical Society Press, where he is editor of the quarterly popular history magazine, Traces of Indiana, Midwestern History. Over his more than 3 decades working in Indiana history, he has written numerous articles and books on Hoosier notables, including biographies of astronaut Gus Grissom, suffragist and peace activist May Wright Sewell, author and diplomat Lew Wallace, journalist and political speechwriter John Barlow Martin, and World War II correspondent Ernie Pyle, just to name a few. Ray Boomhower is currently working on his third book in what he is calling a correspondent trilogy, writing about the wartime career of Richard, and I always say his name incorrectly. Can you help me out? It's not Treginski, it's
Tregaskis.
Tregaskis. I always say it wrong. Thank you.
That's all right.
And so with that, I'm going to pass it on over to you, Ray.
I'm going to introduce the person I'll be talking to this evening. It is Matthew Kochevar, who is a practicing attorney in Indiana, currently serving as co-general counsel at the election division of the Office of the Indiana Secretary of State, and as minority counsel on the Indiana Recount Commission. And though he was born in Dalton, Georgia, he had the good sense to quickly move to Northwest Indiana in Maryville. He's a graduate of Valpo University, with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and History, and is a Juris Doctor as well. He's been a member of the Democratic Party since 2006 and the Indiana Young Democrats since 2009. And in that time, Matt has served on the Indiana Young Democrats Executive Committee as First District Chair, First District Vice Chair, and National Committee Representative. And we're going to have a conversation tonight about Indiana elections and voting. But before we get into the real nitty-gritty of Indiana politics and elections, I want to ask you if you have a favorite fun fact looking at the long history of Indiana elections and voting, that something that is a particular favorite of yours looking back through the years.
Well, thanks, Ray. Probably the best fun fact that I know of is actually something that you'll find on the Secretary of State's civics page. It's something I learned from my former counterpart, the Republican attorney at the election division, because he had a book on interesting facts, and something I've been able to trace back to an old article that was once written by former U.S. Senator Harry New, when he wrote for the Indiana History magazine at the time, back in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. Essentially, the title of how I know it is that it's called "The Vote That Shook the World." It essentially is that a voter in Northeast Indiana remembered that he had promised a candidate for the state house that he was going to vote for him. Mm-hmm. And so, remembering that, on election day in the middle of the afternoon, he saddled his horse, went over to the county seat in what is DeKalb County, and cast his ballot for that state rep. That state rep ended up winning after contesting the election by one vote, the vote of that voter. The state rep in question's name is Madison Marsh, who was a Democrat. His vote was the vote that decided who would be elected in 1843 to the U.S. Senate, because, as you know, at that time, the state legislature in joint session would elect our United States senators. Right. Being a Democrat, he voted for the Democratic candidate. His vote was the deciding vote. And that Democratic senator, Senator Hannigan, would be, in his time there, would be embroiled in the debate about whether or not we should declare war on Mexico, which he cast one of the deciding votes on the matter. And as a result of the war with Mexico, we gained a number of pieces of territories that would eventually become the American Southwest and the Sun Belt. And so as is stated on the Secretary's website, one vote for a particular office can, in the end, really reshape the United States and create, again, what we know as probably some of the most populous and probably more popular places in our country right now.
That's right. So one vote can really make a difference.
Yes.
Can really sway history
Mm-hmm.
in its wake. Well, let's get into the nitty gritty of political parties and partisanship, which is high these days. But political parties were not seen, were not looked on favorably by some of the founding fathers, including James Madison, who in Federalist Number 10 warned against mischiefs of faction, and later said that surely our government may go on and prosper without the existence of parties. He said, I've always considered their existence as the curse of the country. So how do we get to where we are, a very strongly established, entrenched two-party system, and the whole election process that we now have in the United States? I know that's a lot to go into, but let's look at political parties and how they got to be so entrenched in our system.
Sure. Sure, and even George Washington was against political parties and cautioned against the fractionalism of the country that political parties would cause in his farewell address. I can't quote for it off the top of my head at the moment, but he too was not in favor of political parties. But at least what I could recall from grade school and being a member of a political party, it almost seems natural, as in the DNA of our country, that we will naturally divide on certain issues and seek to be around those who agree with us. I mean, even since the first election in 1788, 1789, it would almost seem that the parties and that those representatives, especially in Congress, would see themselves as dividing themselves. Look at any article or any textbook, and you even see in there that while there weren't any political parties, no one was elected under a political party in the first Congress, you usually see people listed as either being pro-administration or anti-administration. I think that always has to go back to, even before the Constitution, disagreements with the Articles of Confederation. How vast should the federal government be? What power should it have? What power should it have in relation to states? And then using that foundation, building up to, what should we be focusing on? What should be our foreign policy, our economic policies, and our other domestic policies? And so you see that natural divide into the Federalists that are controlled by Hamilton and John Adams as being the two factions of that party, as well as the Democratic Republicans that would be essentially spearheaded by Jefferson and eventually by Madison. As a Democratic Republican, I mean, he became president and was elected as a Democratic Republican and really continued that Virginia dynasty that was started by Jefferson and ended by Monroe. And I should state here, as we get further down the field, is that while we are a two-party system, there hasn't always been two political parties. There have been various different political parties, even various factions of the political parties who were in power. But for whatever reason, it always seems that our view of history, what have you, there always seems to be two main ones that are always vying for control. Except for, I will add on a caveat here, and I suggest anyone read into this. I actually have a book back here from one of the historians who worked in the House of Representatives, who went through the entire history of the U.S. House. There was a time after the Whigs started to fracture in the late 1840s and into the 1850s, that there was, at least in one Congress, there was such a division in in which parties had representation in Congress that they couldn't figure out who was going to be elected Speaker. And in the end, I believe a Free Soiler ended up being Speaker for that term, but after they went through so many ballots. Right. It's that after the Whigs split, you see the formation of the Republican Party, who really find success during the Civil War. Much of the Democratic Party, based in the southern states, split, formed the Confederacy during the Civil War. And so after the Civil War, you see that domination of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Though there is always a split in the Republicans between the more Republicans who would become more business-friendly, Gilded Age, and then the split of those who felt that the Republicans had lost some of that liberalism that had
progressive touch.
That progressive touch there, and become more of liberal Republicans. Yeah. Now, skipping ahead, and really one of the things I was thinking about, and what I know from a more of election administrative perspective, is that the two-party system is at least successful here is because the system is, for lack of a better term, intertwined. It is built that way. If you look at the election code, a part of that election code is about, well, who can get ballot access?
Right.
And it is really based on a party's success in a particular election. In this state, we rely on the Secretary of State's election. So every 4 years, Secretary of State goes up for election. And under our state code, the candidates of the political parties who are the top 2 vote getters will play a role in election administration. There are members of those parties. Their members will be the co-directors. My boss, the Democratic co-director, Brad King, who's the Republican co-director. And they have to be members of that party. Those party chairs get to nominate those individuals for the governor to appoint. Those party members will have representation on the Indiana Election Commission, which is the body that administers election laws in the state. They have representation in each county election board, which is charged with administering the election in each county. They also get to pick the poll workers, or the parties get to nominate the poll workers, to be more specific, which will be appointed actually automatically by the county election board, and they will oversee the election. On top of that is also the party access. Primary election, and who will run a primary to nominate their candidates for placement on the November general election, is based on what percentage that political party's candidate for Secretary of State got in the election. If you've received 10% or more of the vote, you get party access to the primary. Between 2 and 10%, you get to nominate your candidates at conventions, which is what the Libertarians do now. If you get below 2%, you have to go through the process of getting petition signatures signed by Indiana registered voters and submitting them for verification at county voter registration offices, and then filed with us here at the state level. And that is based on the amount of signatures one needs to get on the ballot, is based on a calculation of the Secretary of State's election. And so that's why it's intertwined. And I can trace that going back to at least 1933. Luckily, I believe it's Brad King had a relationship with the Stearns family. Edwin Stearns was a longtime attorney general in the 1950s and 1960s. I believe he also served on the state election board before that point. And so he had a large collection of election materials the state election board used to put back together, and we keep them in our library. And so that process that we have now, we had back in the 30s, and I believe I can trace it back, and we had it back when the state started printing ballots and really managing elections after the 1888 election, which I hope to touch on in a different question, because I do find interesting the 1888 election, and it could be a very keystone in how we do elections today.
Let's get into that, because the way we vote today is quite different from what how our ancestors voted in the 19th century. So what were campaigns and voting like for individuals early on in Indiana statehood and leading up to that 1888 election, which is so critical to how we vote in Indiana? It was kind of the state didn't have a lot to do. Parties played a big role in actually providing ballots to voters. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. So between, at least looking back at even during the territorial times, the Northwest Territory and the Indiana Territory more specifically, I am quite amazed by the evolution of how elections have been conducted for that nearly 80, 90-year period. I actually have a book right here that a friend of mine who serves in the Illinois legislature gave me. It is titled "This is What Democracy Looks Like" by Lisa Chen. It is a book that has a lot of visual depictions of what ballots used to look like, going all the way back to the 1817 election. But what they cover in the more written parts of that is that even before we started doing paper ballots, the traditional method of election was you wanted to vote, you went to your county seat, or even in that case, you went up to FinCENS, to the territorial government seat. There was an election clerk there. You announced yourself. You announced what candidate you were voting for, and I would say in this case, the territorial delegate to Congress. On occasion, that candidate would be there, and in a very astute manner would bow and thank the voter for his vote. But as you can imagine, people get very nervous about announcing who they want to vote for. Can create a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of glares. Hopefully not violence, but it's not out of the question. And so because of that, and also because that the country was growing in population so much, there had to be evolutions in the election process. And that leads into more of the paper ballot era, except that the government didn't print the ballots, as we've alluded to. It would be the political parties would print their ballots.
And they made sure to make them different from one another so that they knew who voted for them.
Yes, they would try to make that distinction but there are various elections, and there is an example I have in my ballot book where a party got a hold of another party's ballot and would copy it to make its font and its color look similar, and so to try and confuse voters. Like, yes, this is this party's ballot. Go ahead and cast this one when it's actually not. And other shenanigans that were pulled to try and get a leg up on one another. The fun fact I gave you, the reason why that election was contested was because the voter, Henry Shoemaker, when he arrived, he couldn't find a ticket that he wanted to vote for. And by ticket, I mean the actual listing of all the candidates he wanted to vote for. I only can assume that he wanted to vote for some candidates here from that party, some candidates from that party. And so what he did was that he made up his own ballot. He essentially grabbed a number of tickets that were already pre-printed, took a penknife that the election inspector over there gave him, and he cut out the names he wanted, put all those pieces of paper together, rolled them up, and deposited them in the ballot box, and it was accepted by the inspector. And there were times where that was acceptable. There's examples I have in this book where there were different ballots printed for different offices, like for the judiciary here and for Congress here, and so you could mix and match your different tickets together, roll it up, and deposit it into the ballot box for counting. So with the political parties printing the ballots, there always leads to periods and different vote fraud schemes. Ignoring outright intimidation of voters, because there are party people, we'll call them employees, party people who work for the party boss, who are set up outside the polling location. They got their ballots to hand off to people. They're trying to cajole, threaten, or just classically buy off voters, say, hey, vote for this ticket, it'll be worth your while. In the 1888 elections, the Republicans engaged in a scheme where they gave their different party officials out in the local areas money to start buying off voters and say, hey, here's your money, go vote this ticket, go vote this ticket.
It could be cash or alcohol often.
Cash
in the
or
early
alcohol.
days. Yeah.
I would even imagine there was probably a promise of jobs out there, which is that's why we had the patronage system for a reason.
Right.
But the Republicans got caught. Now, while Benjamin Harrison would claim he had nothing to do with it, and probably also had the fallback that as U.S. attorney, I think about 10 years before he ran for president, or I think it was 10 years, could be a little bit more, that he actually prosecuted a similar scheme that was conducted in Indiana. The problem is that the marshal that he had for the job was the treasurer of the Republican Party, and was the one who is, at least from the article that I read, was the one who was engaged in possibly masterminding the whole scheme. But for whatever reason, this came out into the press. People became outraged by it. But
yes, it's famous William Dudley, the whole blocks of five,
Yes, the blocks of five. Yes.
Controversy, which was a big issue at the time.
But luckily at that time, there was a model that was coming out of Australia where the government was printing the ballot. Every party was appearing on it. And a lot of states started to use that model. And in the 1890s, Indiana adopted that model. And that model of balloting is actually in, various forms were changed. And as we changed election laws, we created, outside of paper ballots, ballot machines from the old iron. I refer to them by their nickname, like the old Iron Horse. I'm trying to remember their actual usage, but they were the big machines where you hit the little clicks and voted there. Optical scan ballot cards. Yes, right there, and then
it's
eventually
a very satisfying way to vote because you clang that thing shut.
The lever machines, that's what I'm thinking of. The
old
lever machine ballots.
Mm-hmm.
But but essentially the paper ballot, the ballot design, really hasn't changed since the adoption of the Australian model in the 1890s, which is essentially the listing of the straight party ticket, and then the listing of each of the party's candidates. Now, at the beginning, and even into most of the 20th century, the ballot, at least the paper ballots that were produced by the state, were listed more. I'm trying to say listed vertically. So it was the first party was listed in the first column, and it had all its candidates from your straight party ticket, your president, governor, what have you, and then the next party, and then the next party based upon state law. That is not really in use anymore. We really have reoriented the ballot where it follows each office goes down vertically, and then inside that you list each of your candidates. But essentially that model of how we list ballots, which party goes first, has been the same. I have in my collection here an old 1944 war ballot, the federal one at the very least. And yes, it was specifically titled in legislation to be called the war ballot. Brad King is also a noted collector of old things, political memorabilia, and he has in his office, I believe, a 1900 McKinley Bryant ballot that he has framed, if I'm trying to remember. Nonetheless, that is just something that's very interesting, is that, and something I really want to get across here tonight is that, you know, elections have changed in some ways here and there over the years, but really when you look at the whole foundation of how we do elections, especially in this state, really hasn't changed that much since we adopted our Australian model, at least in my opinion. Local administrators run elections. Ballot layouts are essentially the same, and the certification of those results and what the state does remains for the most part relatively static.
And Indiana kind of led the way, didn't it, with the passage of the Australian ballot in the 1890s. It's a model that other states followed, because I think Indiana was one of the first states to adopt that system of voting because of the scandal here in Indiana. So we kind of led the way in that. And then one of our candidates, William Henry Harrison, in the 1840s, kind of presaged all the campaign hoopla that we are used to today, with his famous campaign ball and rolling the ball, keep the ball rolling. And I know you did a little bit of research into that. There's General Harrison, the hero of the War of 1812 and the Battle of Tippecanoe. And if you could talk about some of the imagery and excitement of Harrison's campaign in the 1840 deal, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, what was going on with that?
Well, for me, the 1840 election and what the Whig Party did is really the beginning of a lot of the things you see in modern campaigns today. Right. You see political handbills, the passing out of political literature, the use of campaign slogans, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, for instance, the beginning of campaign songs, which I always get a kick out of. I listen to Ken Rudin's Political Junkie podcast almost weekly for since I discovered it, and he always begins his intro with the four campaign songs that were used both in the 56 election with Ike and Adlai Stevenson, as well as the 1960 campaign songs for Kennedy by Frank Sinatra, and the one for Richard Nixon, which for whatever reason I really get a kick out of the Richard Nixon one. It's a catchy, folksy tune, but I'm a big fan of folk music myself. But going back to the 1840 election, that's where you really see a lot of that campaigning that we know today. Political party folks breezing into town, talking with voters, trying to convince them to vote for their guy. Now, the 1840 election wasn't the first time that was used. They were using nicknames for Jackson in 1832 and 1836, but I can only imagine that there was some smart party boss or official in the smoke-filled back room where the Whigs met and thought, they were doing this, I know how to do it better. And they did do it better because on top of really bumping up Harrison as a man of the people, you know, serve the government, lives a more solitary life. He's not rich and an aristocrat and everything. He's just like you. One of the first times we're actually seeing that, but they actually really hit at the incumbent. It's like Van Buren. Van Buren's the cause of all your troubles. Economic depression, it's his fault. And, you know, he's this fancy, I imagine he's this fancy New Yorker who really doesn't understand what's going on. Don't vote for this. Don't vote for him for re-election. Let's send an honest to good, hardworking, I don't know if they used Midwesterner at the time, but essentially Midwesterner to
war hero.
Yeah,
exactly.
War hero.
Yeah.
Yes, the everything that you see there is going to be used over and over again in the 1860s, waving the bloody shirt and what Grant did, all the way up to really George W. Bush and his folksy charm.
Right.
If you put that in air quotes.
Mm-hmm. How does restrictions come into play on voting? At one time, Indiana was fairly loose, even allowing immigrants who were new to the state, who had declared that they were intended to become U.S. citizens, even they were allowed to vote.
Mm-hmm.
But how were restrictions like voting, you know, voting ID and checking the ID, how did that come into play in Indiana politics and elections?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you always need to look back in that there are always restrictions in voting in various different ways, either because it was custom, and in that I'm referring to that the only qualified voters through much of the state's history were white males over the age of 21. It was embedded in the Constitution, as you know, and I think we have another question on that, where, you know, women did not achieve the right to vote until 1920. Blacks, African Americans in the state did not gain the right to vote until the passage of the 15th Amendment, and even so, barriers were put in place.
Nice.
Intimidation was engaged in to make sure they were kept from voting. So there has always been that one on restrictions of part of this population, of our population. On top of that, I don't know. I mean, we're used to now having voter registration and requiring a person to register to vote before an election, but voter registration did not come into practice until really the early 20th century. I mean, we had to amend our state constitution to provide for that. Before then, you were, you know, if you wanted to vote, you went to your polling location up to your county seat, and you said who you were, and you cast your ballot. But I don't know the history of why we added in voter registration. I only can imagine is that just the size of the population growth here in the state and throughout the country, on top of the changes in voter qualifications, that you had to be a U.S. citizen, that you had to reside in the state for a certain period of time, almost seemed to necessitate that we have to have a pre-registration of residents in the state to become qualified voters. As for the more modern voter ID and other restrictions, the voter ID law is still relatively new. As I was in high school still at the time, but as I seem to remember that it was a policy point of the Republican Party at the time, who was at that time had control of both houses of the legislature and control of the governor's office for the first time since the end of Bob Orr's term in the late 1980s, and thought that it was a necessary security measure to that we needed to have in our election code and in our election processes. And even though it is stated in my biography, you read it through there, that I'm a Democrat, I am trying to stick to as much of an understanding of what folks had previously said about these measures, not trying to give my own personal view of whether I think it's right or wrong. So I'm not going to try and enter into that. If I do slip, I will apologize to our folks here. On top of that, I mean, you know, one of the things that we're talking about now is absentee voting. And, you know, why is it not now more liberalized? I will tell you that the absentee voting, especially absentee voting by mail, of the process
Right.
of applying for an absentee ballot, having a specific reason why you need to absentee vote by mail, and getting that delivered by election day. That's something that's not new. That's actually pretty old. That goes back, again, I can trace it back to the 1930s. That foundation of what we do hasn't changed. Really, the changes have been a little bit subtle of how you're supposed to deliver it, using first-class mail and paying for postage to return, for the voter to return that ballot, adding on various reasons, because it used to just be for if you were in the armed forces, or if you just had a generic expectation of being absent from your county on election day. And we've added on things for there. But to try and get back to your question, the restrictions on voting, yes, there are many, and they have been put in place by the legislature for various reasons, whether they are a security measure or just this is how we do things. Of course, they are, I always think that my opinion is that the legislature should always take a look at those and review them and genuinely do a balancing test on those, on the need for safe and secure elections, as folks say, as opposed to making sure that a person in the state, of a qualified voter who is registered, has the ability to cast a ballot if they so choose to participate in this election. Certainly on the voter ID law, there are, I imagine, many ways where we can maintain that security that some hold very dear, but at the same time, making sure that the voter has the opportunity to cast a ballot that will be counted for that election.
Right. Before we start getting into some of the questions that we have put out on the chat here, I've got one question I think is going to be I think fun for you to answer. What would you consider to be the three most important political races in Indiana's history? There are three that stand out to you as particularly important to our state.
Yes. So I was, up until a couple hours ago, I was thinking about that as a particular election year, as opposed to a political race. So I'm going to answer it in the latter, what I've been thinking about mostly today. The first one is the 1888 presidential election, over a lot of the reasons that we just went over. I believe what happened in that presidential election is the main reason how we do elections today. The second one is for me, the 1970 U.S. Senate election between incumbent Vance Hartke and challenger Congressman Richard Roudebush, if I recall. At that time was the closest election in U.S. Senate history, and I believe today it remains the closest election, or at least statewide election, in state history. Why I consider that to be important is not the election itself, but the aftermath of it. That is because the election was so close that Congressman Roudebush filed for a recount. But Vance Hartke went into federal court and said that the Constitution doesn't allow it, do not allow for this recount. And that case made it all its way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said that, yes, states can have laws where they can do recounts, but the final decider of the election rests with the United States Senate. So you can do your recount, you can provide, in this case, the U.S. Senate with different results and what you found in that recount, but in the end, they are the deciders of that election. They will determine who their member is going to be. And then I guess for the third one, if I can think of anything else, really it's going to be, and it's another one that led to a recount, but it's going to be the 1984 election in the 8th Congressional District between Congressman Frank McCloskey and I believe it was, I'm going to say Joel Decker. Don't quote me on that. I'm really going off of memory here right now, but the Republican challenger. Again, very close election. Led to a recount. But at the time, we didn't have great recount laws. Each of the counties did them. But it's also because of that, the House took up the recount. They did their own recount. And it led to some pretty interesting theatrics and debates on the House floor.
Seemed like the
is
election would never end. I remember
an
that.
election that would never end.
Mm.
In the end, the House took up its responsibilities under the Constitution, determined what the final results were, sat McCloskey. But a lot of people, especially in national politics and those who review that election, really consider that as one of the tipping points in the fractionalism we see between the political parties. Because that is one issue that, for instance, Newt Gingrich took to heart in his attacks on the speaker that really propelled him into the spotlight and would eventually raise his profile enough where he could make a run for House GOP leadership and would eventually become speaker. But those are the three for me personally that are pivotal, were pivotal elections, at least my top three. And I know that there are a whole lot more out there. I'd love to be able to talk to all of them if we had enough time today, but those are my top three.
Let's look at some of the questions we've gotten in the chat. If you have a question you want to pose to Matt, please put it in the chat for now. One that is particularly topical, and I'll phrase it to have it apply to Indiana. What protections does the state have in place in case someone like the incumbent governor decides he's defeating an election, it looks like, but he refuses or she refuses to accept that result? What protections does the state have in place to make sure that the election results are lived up to?
Okay. Well, the first answer is that if we don't certify, I want to figure out how to place this and think of my procedures, is that if he doesn't accept it, the governor is going to be out of luck. I mean, obviously he could file for a recount. He actually can't file for an election contest because we at the state, at least at the election division, don't actually certify the result. In the state constitution, the General Assembly in joint session actually looks over the results, and they're the ones who certify it. These are the results here. They usually do it on inauguration day as a pro forma matter, and then they go and inaugurate the governor. And we've done this for I imagine every election since our Constitution under the 1850s. But of course, the governor wants to dispute it. I will leave it to him and his lawyers to figure out whatever legal remedies that they have. But in the end, the legislature will look over the results that are given to them, and they will need to follow their constitutional mandate of certifying it. And so we can inaugurate whoever that winner is for governor and lieutenant governor. And I'm not while I am aware of vacancies and whatever, I am not caught up right now on what happens if there is a dispute where even the joint session can't figure out what happens. I believe there's something in there where there will someone who will sit as governor. Who that will be, possibly the speaker, I think, but don't quote me on that. I would have to go look at the state constitution to render my personal opinion. And on here, I do want to state, I should have stated at the top, everything I'm telling you right now, I'm telling you as in my personal capacity as a individual, not as an employee of the Indiana Election Division. If you do have questions that you want a more formal answer to in regards to elections, please contact us at our office during regular hours, or place it in writing, and I will put it before our co-directors to see what they would like to opine on. I just want to put that out right there for
Thanks,
that particular
Matt.
question.
Yeah, appreciate that. Let's throw up an image of the Benjamin Harrison campaign ball just for fun. Beth, do you want to throw that up on the screen just so people can see what we were talking about earlier? Hold on. I don't know if Beth can get to that or not. Maybe not. So we'll go instead to some more questions from the chat. Was voter turnout as low in the 1800s as it is now percentage-wise? Or as I remember it, voter turnout was quite high in the 19th century, particularly compared to today. Matt,
I, be-
is that the case?
I believe that is the case. Brad King probably would be able to top the numbers off the top of my head. I know he's taken a keen interest in that, and he's been doing election history and election administration probably longer than I've been alive. And but I believe that's higher. I actually have seen the results because we keep them in our office. Someone compiled the data long ago, where voter turnout has been exceptionally high from the 1930s straight up till 1994, especially in midterm elections. Because as any of you imagine, turnout is always highest in the presidential election because it's the sexier election, I guess we'll say. Midterm elections are not as much, but at least in the 1960s, especially the 1970s, turnout was in the 60s and the 70s. Really fell off in the state in the midterm elections, beginning in the 1990s with 1994. I don't know, for whatever reason, possibly a generation of voters that really took to heart voting, possibly died off, possibly the political party fighting and the rise of cable news possibly really soured people on voting and they hadn't vote. I really can't tell you why, but I do know that we've had higher turnout in many elections. I think going back to if I remember articles from after the 2014 election, that was probably our lowest turnout since the 1920s.
Okay. Okay.
That
I think Beth has
well.
that image of the campaign ball from Benjamin Harrison. Beth, if you want to throw it up on the screen. There it is.
Ah.
Keep the ball rolling, and there it is in front of Harrison's house on North Delaware Street. You'll notice that there's no picket fence around the Harrison home as there once had been. When he received the Republican nomination, the well-wishers came and, of course, flocked to his home to celebrate his nomination, and they took away the picket fence pieces as souvenirs. And in fact, I think the Harrison home has one last remaining picket from that fence. So,
and I like that picture. I saw it earlier today while I was brushing up on some of my facts here, and I mentioned this before we began today, is that I really wish that as long as the folks who oversee the Benjamin Harrison House and the folks in the city, I really wish we can create a more modern photo. Someone create a ball for that. Let's put it on the street next to his home, and let's get a bunch of voters out there, and let's snap a picture, because I find that to be neat, the slogan, and I'm a big sucker for homages, and definitely that Maryland voter who put that together and pushed it all the way up the national road to Indianapolis. God bless him, because I imagine that Benjamin Harrison really took that to heart in remembering his grandfather and the position that he would find himself in short months later when he was elected.
That's dedication for you. Here's a question for you, Matt. You spoke about the voter ID statute. Has it been amended so that college students with an ID can use that as their state ID? Someone recalled that in 2008, a Ball State student could not use their ID because there was no expiration date on it. Do you have any information about that?
Yep. So the actual voter ID law, which is actually the definition of what a voter ID is, has not changed since it was implemented in 2005. So it is more than likely that the IDs issued by state educational institutions, which are viewed as entities of the state of Indiana, so it meets that first criteria, has changed. I do know over the last couple of years since I've been at the division, I believe IU, at least on one of their campus, had changed to account for this. Purdue, I think, also started making a change where they were adding on the expiration date. And so while the law has not changed, the state institutions have been updating their IDs so the students can use them when they choose to register to vote at the address that they live at while they're at school and become a voter in that precinct.
Do you foresee, in your opinion, that Indiana will ever move to a same-day registration system, or some way that it just make it easier for people to vote?
there's always a possibility. I will state this: I am not, and I just say this because I like Johnny Carson, and I'm not Karnak. I cannot predict the future. I imagine that one day we will have it. Now, whether it'll be because it will be widely accepted throughout the country that same-day registration is no burden on election officials, and a lot of the objections to it that some folks may have in the state legislature are dissolved, that we will get it. So I would always premise it that it will always be a matter of time. I just don't know when we will get that. I know there's a bill filed each year. I think, I'm trying to remember, that at least there was discussion among Republicans about some form of it, but it never did go anywhere. So I will say this: as with everything, talk with your state legislators if you care about this issue. Join organizations that this is part of their of the reason why they exist, and support them. Definitely attend state election committee meetings, both in the Senate and the House. And it should be a lot easier this year because my understanding is that they're going to be as virtual as possible. So definitely keep up on that and talk with your state legislative representatives about, I like this bill, you should pass this and have the governor sign it.
Right.
As also, I don't like this bill, please don't pass it. We don't agree with it.
Like the way it is. One of our attendees put in a plug for the Election Protection, which is a nonpartisan national voter assistance hotline, 866-R-VOTE, and there are a lot of volunteer operators answering questions you have about voters every day. So that's a good service for people to use if there are any questions. And someone asked, why was Indiana so reluctant to allow expanded absentee voting? It worked well in the primary, and he or she would have liked to use it in November. Why do you think that was?
So I will refer you over to, because there are various different reasons for that. I'll refer you over to the governor's comments, the secretary's comments. But I was anticipating that we get asked this today, but I'm just stating how I remember certain comments that have been made publicly. For the governor, it's his perspective is that we are not under the same emergency orders that we had leading up to the primary. That is what the governor has said. For the Secretary of State, she stated a lot of those same reasons, as well as that, we have a certain election procedure in state law, and also the claim that there are folks who do like to vote absentee in person, but it's just that the Election Commission has not seen, or at least fit to bring up this matter and put it to a vote where all 4 members could agree to allow for it. So that is that reason. So I would suggest to everyone here, and when you talk with everyone else, is to look on our website, or also look at the Indiana voter portal, indianavoters.in.gov, and look for the information about the different ways that we have voting in this state. If you do want to look over by mail, we do have that application. There are the reasons. Do look at them, look through all of them, and determine if any of those reasons would apply to you on election day. That's my standard spiel I give when everyone calls the office. But also do look into, if you feel that you're not able to complete that application, you need to, or you just want to vote in person, there's nothing wrong with that. Do look into what options you have for what we call early voting, a form of absentee voting in October, or voting on election day, there will definitely be, at least the poll workers will be using precautions. Personal protective equipment will be there, so definitely, what I'm trying to say is definitely look at all your options and have a plan for voting, whatever method you decide to use.
Before COVID, in previous elections, have you had a way that you preferred to vote? Did you prefer voting early, in person, or how did you look at it?
So I have not voted on election day since 2000, the primary in 2011, which was really not a primary at all, because I'm from Lake County, so I lived in Lake County at the time. there was no one. What was it? Yeah, there was. I believe it was an uncontested primary,
Right.
and so I just went in and voted. That is the last time I voted in person on election day. I usually absentee vote or early vote because I've always been a poll worker. I've been doing poll worker or election day activities for the Democratic Party, for which I'm a member, since I became a voter in 2006. And a majority of that has been a poll worker, and I love being a poll worker. I thought that was awesome. And so this is my plug here to say, if you're interested in the election process, you're not doing anything on election day, I strongly suggest you contact your county election board and ask how you can sign up to be a poll worker. But my preferred method has always been to vote in person. I just like going over, in this case, the city county building. I check in with my ID. I like using the ballot machine where I put in my ballot and then I have the touch screen. It's what we call the hybrid model, where it's like I don't have to fill in all the bubbles. I can have just a machine auto mark my ballot and then put it in the envelope, get it signed, say hello to some of the local election administrator folks, and then go about my day. Of course, out of necessity, I am voting by mail. I've already cast my ballot. It's back in the mail, and that's just as a precaution of if I don't have to go anywhere, if I don't have to go over the city county building, I prefer not to go. I'm practicing as much social distancing as I can. I really only go to work and then I come back home and do things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I enjoy going to vote in person myself, and that's what I plan. I do plan on early voting this year, and I'm lucky enough to be in a place where I can walk to a place to do that early voting. So I want to thank Matt and turn it back over to Beth, who has some parting words for all those who attended today.
Yes, thank you so much, Matthew and Ray. And I have to agree, I also am typically an early voter because fellow poll worker. So I will also give that plug as something to check out. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight as well. Next week on October 1st, we are exploring art history with the Harrison Center for the Arts. And keep an eye out for more history happy hours. We have some coming up on cemeteries, wedding fashion, World War I, and so much more. So
Kurt
time,
Vonnegut too. I'll put a plug in for Vonnegut.
Yes, yeah, Vonnegut's
my
coming
favorite
up too.
Hoosier.
Same time, same place, but a new link. So we also have one with Dr. James Madison on October 15th with his new book, The Ku Klux Klan in the Heartland. So all of these and more, you can sign up at indianahistory.org, get more information about that and other virtual offerings that we have, things coming to a internet-connected device near you. If you missed your chance to donate or would like to further your gift, thank you for everyone who has donated already. If you'd like to support the Indiana Historical Society, please visit indianahistory.org/virtual-resources/donate. Don't worry, we'll drop that in the chat. Your donation allows us to continue to share Hoosier stories, so thank you for those contributions. Now, tomorrow sometime, you will be getting an email from us. And it's going to have a whole bunch of links in it that are all from tonight's presentation. There will also be a survey included. It'll take about 1 minute or so to answer. We'd love to know what you thought of tonight, any feedback that you have, because that helps us make programs like this even better. We will be posting this conversation on the IHS YouTube channel in the next coming weeks. So you can be looking at that in a few weeks. Everyone, thank you so much for coming out with us. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane, and make sure you vote. Thank you. We'll see you guys in the future. Have a good night. All right.
Another one bites the dust. Yeah, good job, Matt.
Thank you. I wish we had gotten to the last question because I would have given you
Got
I
everyone.
would have given you Doc Bowen.